I think the traditionalists amongst us are about to get a little salty with me. Holy golly, what a day. Oh, delicious every time. I'm going to address it right off the jump. Yes, I'm about to machine dovetails. And your question, right from the very beginning, may be, Eric, why are you routing dovetails? You are a high-end professional furniture maker. You can cut dovetails by hand. What is the benefit of using a router? And that is an excellent question. There are reasons to cut dovetails by hand, and there are reasons to cut dovetails by machine. Firstly, I should say, one is not necessarily better than the other. One may take a higher level of hand tool skill, but one is not inherently better than the other. You can make a perfectly clean, good, stable joint using a table saw, using a router, using a Panta router, using a CNC, any number of tooling kits that you have available to you. It doesn't make it better or worse than hand-cut dovetails. So, value judgments aside, let's talk about why somebody might decide to cut dovetails by hand versus why somebody might decide to cut them using a machine. When you cut dovetails by hand, you can get as fancy and as intricate as you want. You can have the tiniest of pins. You can have the finest of webs on half-blind dovetails. There is nothing that you can't do with a handsaw and a chisel. Now, we have been so conditioned to believe that thin pins is exactly what we want, but also inherently we understand that thin pins lose some amount of strength. Not all of the strength, they're still plenty strong, but some amount of strength I think you'll warrant. This box is 15 inches wide, and so if I were to have super thin pins on this box, it would look a little funny and it would feel like it's not that strong. And this is a huge component of it that we don't often think. Yes, I might be showing off my ability to cut dovetails by hand, but it's going to put the user somewhat at unease thinking that every time they handle this object, it's going to break because these pins are so fine and minuscule. And we don't want that to happen. So understanding the scale of the object and knowing that these pins want to be a little bit wider, and then that leaves us plenty of room for 5 to 7 really nice tails, figuring out that spacing, all of that works together. And once these pins hit a certain size, in this case they're around 3/8 of an inch, which is pretty standard, there's no reason not to machine them if that's the approach you want to take. So understanding the scale of the object and how it's perceived is definitely a part of the design component. Now, that all being said, and there was a lot said, we should dive into why I made some of the decisions regarding the spacing of the actual dovetails, and then we can get into the cutting of the dovetails themselves on the real project. Now, there are a few things I had to consider when designing and laying out my dovetails. First off, I never do a straight run of dovetails, just the same pin-tail combination all the way across the board. I just find it boring. I find it stagnant. There's nothing interesting. There's nothing variable about it. That may be a thing you like to do. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a thing that I don't like to do. What I typically do instead is I do growing dovetails. What I mean by that is at the bottom of the box, of the chest, whatever it is I'm making, will be the widest tail, and as the tails go up, they get smaller and smaller. The reason for doing this is it gives some upward momentum and a lot of visual weight at the base of the box. Now, the first thing to consider with this piece is I couldn't do that because these components are book matched, meaning there's a center line going right down the board, and if I were to design an asymmetrical dovetail pattern, that means that that book match line is not going to line up with the center of a tail. So that tells me that it needed to be a symmetrical layout, right? The same on the bottom as it is on the top. The other consideration, however, this of course is going to have a drawer in it. As you saw in my video last week, which I'll link up here, whichever corner it's in, there's going to be this cutout. And so I really needed to make sure that the extra pin worked with the visual component of that drawer. Because if this pin right here is too close to this drawer front, you're gonna have this really skinny, doofy looking, and not structurally sound half tail. Or I'm gonna have to forego that tail altogether and run this end grain, this pin up here, and it might just look funny, like it wasn't well thought out. And that's not what we want. Now, I know that's a hell of a monologue and not a lot of woodworking, so let's get into the actual dovetail process now. This is my Lee DR4 Pro jig. I'm not telling you that because I think you should buy it. I'm not telling you that because I'm sponsored by them, which I am not yet. Just throwing it out there. I'm telling you that specifically so that you have an understanding of what machine I'm working with. So here is an excessively brief overview on how this jig actually works. We have these keys which are going to cut both our tails and our pins, depending on how they're oriented and which way you flip them. I'm gonna put a practice piece in here that's the same dimensions as my real board and a sacrificial board behind it. And then I'm going to mark where I want my pins. I'm gonna lay this out pins first. So what I've done is I've got 3 inches here, 3.5 inches here, 2 inches, and then it repeats 3.5, 3. So you have this rhythmic pattern. Once I've marked my center line of my pins and I've laid these out where I want them, then I can actually flip this over, cut my tails first, then I can come back and cut my pins and adjust the width of my pins by moving this particular board in and out. But I've got this all set up. It's time for me to set up my router and cut a practice piece real quick so you can see how this works. Let's do it. So everything looks good and clean on my tails test piece, which means it's finally time to cut the real thing. Now our last side to cut is obviously a little strange because of this drawer cutout. So let's talk about how I'm gonna approach that. So going back to our conversation about layout, part of the reason I designed the dovetail spread this way is because of this situation. So when I'm cutting these tails, I'm simply going in and routing these negative spaces. And now with this space missing, I can just skip that tail and treat everything else exactly the same. So that's what I'm gonna do. All right, with all of our tails cut, now I'm gonna switch out my bit for a straight bit. I'm gonna flip this jig end for end and set this up, and we're gonna cut our pins. All right, so our dovetails look great, but the keen observer might say like, there's a couple of shadow lines and there's a couple of fingernail gaps. Those are what I call shadow lines. They're small enough where, number one, the glue would fill that, but number two, if you're using a water-based glue like a yellow glue or a PVA, those fibers are going to swell enough to close that gap. You don't want such a tight joint that it's going to force all of the glue out. And number two, a joint that tight is just going to be a nightmare to assemble, because the moment you put glue on your joint, it's going to begin to swell and you're not going to be able to drive it all the way home if it's too tight. So don't fret about seeing a minor gap like that. Now we've got one more tailboard to cut for this side, which is going to be a little bit different, so I got to take it to the table saw first. All right, so here's how this is going to work. It's very rudimentary. I have a flat top blade in my table saw, a ripping blade, a joinery blade, however you want to phrase it or use it. This is just an inexpensive ripping blade. I've marked out where I need to remove the bulk of my waste. I don't want to remove all the way up to the pin. I'm going to use the router to do that. What I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to remove the majority of the waste. I'm going to keep my pencil lines on either side so that I have enough meat here to trim this section down, this tenon down, after I've actually cut the pins. And I'm going to use a random scrap of wood to back the piece so that I'm not blowing out fibers on the other side. I'm using my crosscut sled to do this. You can use any homemade sled. You can use a miter sled if you want. You can make up a jig to do this. This is as rudimentary and rough and tumble as you get. I'm literally just cutting a piece of wood on a sled and putting a piece of wood behind it to back up the fibers. That's it. So everything looks good. I'm really happy with the way that everything turned out. This is the critical corner, I think, of this object, so that all of my pins and all of my tails are perfect. Makes me feel really good. I've intentionally left this slightly oversized, so I know this isn't going to fit, but we're gonna see how close it is, and all I have to do now is go back to the table saw and trim these two shoulders so that they're the appropriate width, and then this joint should go together really nicely. So it is exactly as I expected it would be. Got a wide shoulder here. This one is pretty close to perfect. Everything else is lining up really nicely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove more of this shoulder on the table saw, and I'm going to leave this here for now. If it's close enough that I don't want to take it to a table saw, I can do this with a chisel. That's not an issue. But here I've got maybe a 64th to remove, and I've got a pinhole knot here, so I'm going to take this side to the saw. Adjustments done. Oh yeah, she's gonna drive home. Well, might as well continue and just dry fit the whole thing now. All right, let's digest this briefly before we get out of here. First and foremost, aesthetically, I think this does play really nicely. It's got a little bit of a sing-song emotion to it. It's balanced, it's rhythmic. I like the way that it turned out. My center seams, my book match seams line up perfectly, which is absolutely critical, because if those were offset, it would look really funky. Our relief for the drawer looks great. Everything turned out clean. Again, this is kind of the most visually critical corner here, so that everything turned out nice and clean and closes up beautifully. I'm really happy with. And lastly, again, on the sizing of the tails and pins, given the size of this chest, I rather like the bigger, beefier pins, I think. And it's not just a justification. I'm not trying to sit here and justify the use of a router. I think it suits the scale of the piece better than if they were too thin. So all things being equal, 10 out of 10 would recommend. So friends, that's that for this week. And whether or not you choose to apply this technique in your own shop, the thought process, the philosophy remains the same. Don't limit yourself to one skill set, to one approach just because it's the one you know or it's the one that's been romanticized to you. Choose the approach that works for you in your space for a given project. You may be limited in your tooling, you may be limited in your budget, you may be limited in your time. There are other limitations to take into consideration outside of somebody said machine cut dovetails aren't as nice as hand cut dovetails, and so I have to do that. Don't listen to people. Don't listen to the internet. Don't even listen to me. Do your own thing. Completely ignore me if you want. That's part of the beauty of being a thinking individual. But I'm not going to prattle on any longer than I should. Friends, I'll see y'all next week. Cheers.